During my A-levels I did a couple of placements at a place called Peabock on Anglesey, because that's where I'm from. My degree entailed a standard 2 years of lectures and labs and exams, of course, and then in my third year I went to work at a place called Zeneca Specialties, which turned into Avicii Chemicals, I believe, at Blakely in Manchester. That was for 1 year, 12 months solid, straight into my fourth year, which was my final year, where I did a project. So the opportunity arose where I could interview for a PhD at the same school in Manchester. There were a few EPSRC funded or EPSRC funded places going, and I was lucky enough to be selected for one of them. And the area of research that I was interested in was broadly inorganic chemistry. And more specifically, the project was in the field of molecular magnetism, and my project was with a Professor David Collison, who is a world expert in EPR, or electron paramagnetic resonance. And so this whole area was basically the molecular magnetism group. So my current research still does focus on making what we call magnetic complexes. I'm still very much interested in that. Metal complex is essentially a one or more metal ions that are linked together with a type of organic ligand. But essentially a metal cage is anything where you've got metal centers, so in this case they're the grey spheres here, linked together with bridging ligands, we call them. So these so happen to be methoxides, and these shift-based ligands are also involved to connect them all into this metal 7 topology. So we as a group can actually make these with cobalt, nickel and zinc. So in other words, there's a real control over the formation of this. What we're actually interested in, of course, is how these metal centers talk to each other magnetically through their bridging ligands. And they talk to each other through their bridging ligands. And the way we do this is obviously we measure the magnetic susceptibility or the magnetic moment of a material as a function of temperature. These cages can have different topologies, different nuclearities, different shapes. They can even be cages where they're enclosed, like tetrahedra and things like this. The difference between metal complexes and single molecule magnets are essentially that single molecule magnets show an interesting behaviour, and it's a magnetic behaviour. So an SMM, as we call them, is a metal complex. Okay, so it does have numerous metal centres, and they are linked together with a certain organic ligand or a group of ligands. But the interesting fact about these materials is that they will become ordered at a certain temperature or under a certain, what we call the blocking temperature. And even if you take the magnetic field away, then they'll stay magnetized. So the theory behind it is that instead of having pieces of metal in your hard drives, for instance, that have a certain, quite a rather large domain size, you could theoretically have these little cages that could be 10 angstroms in diameter, and they could act as single bits of information to store. Of course, there are stumbling blocks. The main stumbling block is that the blocking temperature, the temperature which you see this phenomenon, is really, really low. It's still very, very low. I'm talking 15 Kelvin, which is pretty cold. So of course, if you know, the real incorporation into an electronic piece of equipment is light years away from that. Magnetic coolants are interesting in their own right. They're essentially, in my field of molecular magnetism, magnetic coolant materials are still polynuclear magnetic complexes. The only difference being is instead of using an anisotropic metal ion like manganese 3+, you'll use an isotropic ion like the iron 3+, or more often gadolinium 3+, which is an F7. They still order like single molecule magnets, so they have some kind of ordering at low temperatures. So if you cool these materials down below a certain blocking temperature again, they will order, but they'll weakly order. And essentially what you do is you place these materials in an adiabatic system where the energy can't release, and you flip on a magnetic field, an external magnetic field, on and off near the vicinity of this material. Essentially they'll become ordered when there's a magnetic field near them. Therefore the magnetic entry of the material is decreasing because they're becoming more ordered in terms of their moments. Once you turn the field off, they start to randomize again, the entropy is increasing. So essentially by flipping the magnetic field on and off, you can change the magnetic entropy, but because you're in an adiabatic system, the temperature of the material has to drop. Okay? So the great thing about this is you can decrease the temperature from, say, 10 Kelvin, which is the blocking temperature of the material, down to millikelvin in terms of temperatures. So this has important ramifications in cryogenic analysis, for instance, in physical measurements and low temperature physics, essentially. Coordination polymers, they're essentially just like organic polymers, but you use metals as your linkers instead of just organically covalently binding carbon atoms together. Okay, so essentially you can get one-dimensional coordination polymers, so you've got a metal, you've got some kind of ligand that links them together, and they just go in one direction. Okay, so they're one-dimensional coordination polymers. Then you can have, say, if you're bonding from two directions, so say forming football nets, for instance, yeah, they're two-dimensional coordination polymers. So all you need are metal ions with linking ligands that will link from both ends. So for instance, 4,4-bipyridyl or 4,4-bipyridine is a very good ligand to use, for instance. And three-dimensional, of course, is where you link them all together into a three-dimensional system. In situ ligand formation is where you take two things, A and B, and you know they're going to connect to form ligand C in the solution. You can just throw them in as A and B with your metal and let them stir. We're taking two ligands that we know can bind many metal centers. Not one, not just one on each, many on each. And so what we want is them to couple together and form these large ligands that can hold many metal centers. So our idea was, if we can form these in situ, because they're just connected by a shift-based couple, we'll make huge clusters. And that's what we did, and it worked because we made a copper 30, which is quite a large cage, copper 14s, copper 10. So we are moving towards the supramolecular kind of area, but still using metal centers, because then we can look at the magnetic properties and how they change when you put different guests in. One area of supramolecular chemistry is host guest chemistry. So a guest may have an affinity for a host because it perhaps fits into that cavity really well, the lock and key sort of synopsis. But the reason they'll do this perhaps is because they partake in hydrogen bonding or pi-pi stacking inside these cages. Either way, it's the study of the bonding beyond the first coordination sphere, as we call it, and that's supramolecular chemistry in a very brief nutshell. Research changes all the time. That's part of the reason I really love it, is that every day is different. Sometimes you expect a result from your PhD student and they say, actually it's done this, it's not done that, it's done this. So this is a challenge, but it's a good challenge. In terms of where we're going to be, I think a more consistent design and synthesis of magnetic materials, and I would love to do more host-guest chemistry with these paramagnetic systems. Many students, when I first present the idea of working in this area, they like the pretty pictures that we can produce. So these cages look fantastic, but it's only when I start discussing the physics behind them that they start to really get interested. The unique selling point of studying chemistry at Bangor is definitely the size of the school. It's much smaller than a lot of the major schools in the UK, and what comes from that is a very much smaller class size. The department sits in between the sea and the Snowdonia mountain range. You've got beautiful Anglesey for the beaches, you've got sporting facilities, you've got your outdoor pursuits. So there's everything you really want here. The other selling point, of course, is that, and this is, I think it's quite rare for a chemistry department in the UK, is that third year students will do a project with an academic, and that will be a 6-month long project, so it's a hefty piece of work that they'll carry out. They'll work with PhD students, with postdocs, and they get to know people much more or much better in the school, and they realise then what research is all about. With a firm grounding of chemistry, you could work in many areas of science and engineering, essentially. You don't even have to stick with chemistry, you don't have to even stick with science. You can get jobs in the finance areas as well, because chemists and scientists in general tend to be good number crunchers, they're good analysts. Chemistry essentially, and this is what I say to a lot of students, will never close a door on you, it just opens doors. You don't have to stay in chemistry, the world's your oyster.